Welcome to Mind Tricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Dr. Aditi Subramaniam, a neuroscientist and science writer. She received her PhD at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neuroscience in India. She works as a medical writer at the Neuroscience Education Institute, where she translates complex neuroscience and mental health research into educational materials for clinicians. With a background in neuroscience and a passion for storytelling, she's dedicated to making science accessible to everyone. Aditi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, just looking forward to a really interesting discussion. Yeah.
I'm really excited to have you on the show. I read your post on Psychology Today, and it had to do with culture and neuroscience, and those are both two subjects that I'm really interested in. And I don't know if you know this about me or not, but I did my dissertation research in Nepal, and I was interested in cultural psychology. And honestly, I don't think I have enough guests on my show about this subject. I'd like more because I love this subject. So I've been really pumped up and excited to talk with you here.
Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, it's really nice to know that you also spent some time in Nepal. So I think you have some personal experience in kind of being immersed in a different culture as well, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah, so you are a neuroscientist and you obviously are very interested in culture. I'd like to get to know my guests a little bit more, and maybe you could start by telling us a bit about your personal background and your pathway to becoming a neuroscientist.
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So just to give you a little background about my career. So I studied neuroscience at graduate school. My PhD work involved investigating eye movements as potential biomarkers for schizophrenia. I conducted MRI kind of studies to ascertain, relationships between gray matter in the brain and eye movement performance in, patients with schizophrenia and their siblings. While I was doing my PhD, I always knew that I loved writing. And a few years after I was done with my PhD, I started a freelancing career in science writing. So, communicating neuroscience and psychology to audiences without, much of a background in these subjects kind of gives me great joy. And I feel like I learn so much. It kind of broadens my horizons as well. And it's a really nice intersection for me between, two of my passions, which are neuroscience and writing. And yeah, now in addition to, my freelancing projects, I work full time as a content developer and writer at a continuing medical education company where I develop educational materials on neuroscience for clinicians. Like you said, coming to what kind of interested me about the topic of culture in the brain. So
Yeah.
I grew up in India. I spent a lot of my formative years there, surrounded by, the sensory richness of sound, color, community. And then I spent, a lot of my adult life in the US, kind of immersed in a totally different culture, one that prizes individualism, self-expression, and, scientific rigor. So I think this kind of biculturalism kind of shows up in small ways every day, in my everyday life. The playlist on my phone, for example, has songs from artists,
Yeah.
ranging from A.R. Rahman, who will always be, a favorite, to Taylor Swift now. And
Uh-huh.
my daughter was born in the US, so she's kind of introduced me to a lot of this, new popular American music. And, I also listen to the occasional BTS numbers. So,
Yeah.
you
Yeah, and
know,
I imagine having children probably really you get to watch the intersection of culture and neuroscience and brain development and child development, and that must be really fascinating for you to see how your daughter navigates those two worlds.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, she's like, a live experiment subject for me, I like to say, because my Psychology Today blog is called Parenting from a Neuroscience Perspective. So, it's really fascinating to see how, she navigates these two cultures. Yeah, so I think this easy mingling of, influences kind of fascinated me long before I had the, vocabulary or the tools to kind of, study them. Like, how does the brain negotiate these overlapping worlds? What happens in these neural circuits when we, code switch, for example? So I think I find these questions deeply fascinating. And, the article that you mentioned, the one that I wrote for Psychology Today, was in many ways an attempt to kind of delve further into these ideas.
Yeah, and you talk about in that article about flexible minds, which I think is a great term. It's really relevant to a clinical psychology practice too, which I know you're not so involved with that, but we talk a lot about psychological flexibility these days, and that's all over the psychology literature. So we'll dive into that a bit. And to start with, let's talk about in your article, you were talking about this idea of creativity
Mhm.
and how exposure to different cultures may expand or enhance creativity. And I'd be interested to hear, like, for starters, how does that come about?
Oh, sure. So I think immersing in multiple cultures is like, giving your mind kind of extra sets of, Lego blocks to work with, so, more pieces mean, you can combine them in more creative
Yeah,
ways.
right.
So, yeah, so just to give one example, that kind of illustrates this really well, the singer Ed Sheeran recently collaborated with Indian singer Arijit Singh to, create the hit song Sapphire, which fuses English pop with Punjabi musical elements. Just the act of fusing these two musical cultures creates something really novel and also, something that appeals across cultures. In my own life, like you mentioned, cooking a masala pasta
Yeah,
using Indian spices or celebrating this, this mashup between Diwali and Halloween, which happened in 2024. A lot of Indians across the US celebrated both festivals on
yeah.
the same day. I think these playful mashups kind of illustrate how, cultural mixing can spark creativity by breaking us out of, routine patterns. And I think science kind of backs this up really strongly as well. Like research finds that people with rich multicultural experiences tend to perform better on classic creativity tasks. They solve more insight problems, they make more unusual associations, like we just talked about, and they also tend to tell more original stories.
That makes perfect sense. And I'm just wondering, as a neuroscientist, are there any brain mechanisms or any studies that have done actually in the brain to support where the development happens for that?
Mhm. So neuroscientifically, while we don't have a single creativity spot in the brain, we do know that creativity involves kind of making new connections between ideas, right? And exposure to diverse cultures kind of provides fresh input for the brain, basically encouraging new neural connections across concepts that a one culture mind might never link. It might never pair these two
Yeah.
concepts. So basically, I think living between cultures kind of keeps the brain's association networks flexible and, richly supplied with novel ideas, which is kind of like the perfect, recipe for creativity.
Yeah, creativity for sure, and also flexible minds, which is what you were talking about. And again, the psychological concept of psychological flexibility, which is so
Mhm.
important. So could you say a little bit more about that? Like this idea of like what does it mean to have a flexible mind,
Uh-huh.
and how would that be to somebody's advantage or play out in in real life?
So when you kind of navigate, two or more cultures, you kind of become a mental chameleon, right, of sorts. You're regularly shifting perspectives without even realizing that you are, and and you're kind of shifting behavioral frames depending on the context. And as you know, I mean, psychologists actually have a term for this skill, like frame switching or
Mm,
code switching. I think I cited this example in my article as well, where our daughter kind of sees us eat, our food with our hands at home, and she doesn't bat an eyelid. She doesn't find that odd, but she's, equally comfortable kind of twirling spaghetti with a fork, or,
yeah.
she likes sushi, so she'll, use chopsticks, and she kind of likes to teach us how to use chopsticks as well. So she can kind of switch cultural rules, without batting an eyelid. And this kind of everyday flexibility in adapting to different norms and behaviors, I think, is exactly what living between cultures kind of trains your brain to do, right? Like instead of having one rigid way to think or act, you kind of realize, hey, there could be multiple, valid ways to approach this. And then, you become adept at kind of choosing the approach that fits, the situation.
Yeah, the eating with the hands is a perfect example. I remember when I first went to South Asia and I was living in Nepal and people were eating with their hands. It kind of blew me away. Like it wasn't a problem or anything, but just the idea that people would eat mushy stuff,
Yeah,
dal and, dal bot, mushy stuff with your hands just took me a while to wrap my brain around it. But then I
right.
really started enjoying it. Now I've got to say I enjoy eating with my hands more than utensils. But it took a while to sort of adapt to that different way of eating.
Getting over that initial surprise can kind of open up different things. It can kind of it teaches our minds to be more agile, I think. Rather than clinging tightly to one worldview, you become more comfortable moving between different lenses, and essentially psychological flexibility, right? Like, because,
Yeah.
and which is a hot topic these days because it's linked to, better problem solving, it's linked to better mental health. And I think, exposure to different cultures is a super natural way to cultivate it because, our minds learn to quickly code switch as needed.
Yeah, and you talk about reducing prejudice as another benefit of kind of working between cultures, and it sort of seems kind of obvious, but what can you say about that with this whole concept of flexibility and
One of the most powerful antidotes to prejudice is meaningful contact with people from other cultures, right? Like, I don't mean, just superficial contact. I mean, like, literally immersing yourself in a different culture. So, there's a big difference between knowing about a group in the abstract versus actually knowing real people from that group. A simple, like, example would be like if somebody invited, me for a Thanksgiving dinner. So far I've just read about, Thanksgiving dinners in textbooks, and the food that people eat during Thanksgiving is so different from the food that we eat during Indian festivals. But just being around people, and then like sharing food, laughter, and stories with someone from a different background, it can kind of dissolve stereotypes remarkably fast. Others kind of cease to be a caricature; they become friends, with feelings and faces. So yeah, psychologists have studied this, contact hypothesis for decades, and the findings are kind of, impressively consistent. Like a huge meta-analysis done of over 500 studies, for instance, found that, intergroup contact reliably reduces prejudice across many different groups and settings. And, when people spend time together, especially under positive or cooperative circumstances, it lowers anxiety about each other, it builds
hmm
empathy, and it kind of, increases our ability to see from the other's perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Like when you're able to sort of walk in somebody else's shoes to a
Mhm.
greater degree, other than just reading about it in a book or watching it on TV, you're much more able to have empathy and understanding for those people. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I think neuroscience is also beginning to kind of, echo these findings. Some studies show, using brain scans kind of show that when we think of people in our in group versus in an out group, different neural patterns can emerge. Areas involved in empathy might be actually less active for the out group initially, but positive contact can actually change that. You're basically humanizing the out group in a way
Yeah.
so that, your brains respond with the same empathy as we would to our own group. So yeah, it can literally melt, exposure can literally melt exclusion in a way. So
Yeah, I really agree with that. You mentioned in your article a bit about this concept of respect and reciprocity across cultures and how important that is. And you brought up this concept of cultural appropriation versus
Mhm,
cultural fusion. That's something that we're seeing a lot, especially in pop culture these days, too.
mhm,
Why is
mhm.
that important to this conversation, do you think?
Yeah, you're right to bring this up. It's not all, sunshine and rainbows when you fuse different cultures. Bringing cultures together can trigger tension, especially if it's one-sided or done without respect. So I think in real life, respect and reciprocity are kind of like the guiding principles that, would separate enriching cultural fusion from something that's more problematic, right? Like I just gave an example of a song that kind of, had a Western artist collaborating with an Indian musician. So when both artists are credited and both musical traditions are, equally and openly acknowledged, it feels like, true collaboration, right? A dialogue between equals. And listeners can tell if there's, mutual respect, right? Like
Yeah.
neither culture is being treated as a mere ornament, right? But there can be a situation where a pop song just samples a sitar sound for exotic flavor and gives no credit to its Indian origins, right? Like that kind of leaves a bad taste. It's as if something essential is being borrowed from the source culture without permission. And, rather than feeling like cultural fusion, which is something that needs to be celebrated, it kind of feels like extraction, right?
Yeah, good point. I think that's very well said. Let's talk a little bit more about the neuroscience of culture. I have a number of these we can kind of go through, and they're all pretty interesting. I'm wondering about this idea about just actual like sensory input and sensory interpretation. Obviously, like you said, and anybody who's traveled to India knows that the sensory environment is very different than it is in the US. And
Mhm,
I absolutely love it. It's just so rich and flavorful. But I guess the question is there some impact of being in a particular environment or culture that has an impact on sensory perception, maybe the way that that might impact the learning of languages, auditory processing, what people pay attention to in the visual spectrum, that kind of stuff. Like, what do we know from neuroscience about brain development and the senses?
Mhm. I think this is a fantastic question because I think it highlights how deeply culture can tune even our basic sensory systems, right? Like,
Hmm.
and the short answer is yes, growing up in different cultural environments can literally shape how we hear, see, taste, basically perceive the world, thanks to the brain's neuroplasticity, which is basically the ability of the brain to rewire with experience. When it comes to the auditory system, for example, if you speak a tonal language like Mandarin Chinese, where pitch inflections kind of change the meaning of a word, your brain's sound processing system kind of develops extra keen pitch discrimination. In fact, research shows that Mandarin speakers' brains kind of encode pitch in speech more robustly than non tonal language speakers. So, this is a beautiful case of neuroplasticity. The brain is basically adapting to the demands of language and it can spill over as well. So, some studies suggest tonal language speakers might even have advantages in musical pitch perception or,
Huh.
at least different auditory skills because they've been training on pitch in a way
Yeah.
since infancy.
Is there an age by which those parts of the brain mature to the point where they're no longer have neural plasticity to the degree that they might while they're still developing?
Yeah, I think something that the neuroscientific world has recently started realizing is that our brains are still capable of change even as adults,
Hmm.
and I think this was very different from what was the accepted view even a couple of decades ago. So our brains might not be as agile as they were when we were children, but adult brains are still capable of pretty striking neuroplasticity.
Kind of a related question, and this has to do with language development, and you
Mhm.
probably see this with your daughter raising her. I'm assuming she has some level of bilingualness to her. And a lot of people ask this question, like, what is the impact on children who are learning two languages simultaneously in terms of, well, how they do with language development, for one, and in terms of brain development and the impact on their brain becoming bilingual people at younger ages? I wonder what thoughts you have on that subject.
Bilingualism is a brilliant example of cultural neuroscience because language is kind of a core part of culture, right? And when you're bilingual or multilingual, your brain isn't it's not just about storing two sets of vocabulary, it's about managing two or more parallel systems, smoothly and constantly. So this appears to kind of confer several cognitive benefits. Research has long seen that bilingual individuals often excel at tasks involving executive function, right? Like
Hmm.
things like problem solving, ignoring distractions, switching between tasks, and mental flexibility. Just the simple act of switching languages, say speaking Spanish at home and English at work, is like a regular workout for the brain's control muscles. You learn to suppress one language while using another, which kind of strengthens inhibitory control, and that's useful in turn for focusing attention in general. So in practice, it seems like bilingual kids kind of tend to become adept at things like sorting tasks, where rules change relative to monolingual kids. And adult bilinguals as well have shown slight advantages in creative thinking and pattern recognition tasks. And I think this is because they can approach problems from different linguistic angles.
Yeah, right. So just the act of having to learn two different structures of language and practice them and shift between really stimulates the brain growth and allows for the person to be more comfortable in different kinds of problem solving. You mentioned executive functioning, and
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense too. So I don't know if you can, if there's a lot of research on this next question I want to ask you. It's a bit of a curveball, Aditi, so I apologize in advance, but I'd be curious about your thoughts on it anyway. Cultures all have different kinds of rituals. Sometimes they involve music and dance, chanting, meditative practices. And the rituals, there's some similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And I wonder if there's any indication that those different kinds of practices impact brain functioning or brain development in any kind of way.
Sure. So these rituals, they often involve repetition, rhythm, and intense focus or group coordination, right? And all of these can leave measurable marks on the brain. So just to break down a couple of types of rituals, like for example, dance and music rituals. Like if you imagine a group dancing in sync to a drum beat or a congregation kind of singing together in a church, what's happening neurobiologically here, right? Like first, synchronizing with others, you kind of trigger a rush of neurochemicals that kind of foster social bonding and connection. So, studies have shown that when people dance in unison, for example, or sing together, they often experience a release of endorphins, which are the brain's, feel good opioids. This not only kind of makes them happier, but also has been found to increase pain tolerance, which is a proxy for endorphin release. So, one experiment kind of demonstrated that synchronized dancers could hold a painful pose for longer than non-synchronized dancers,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And moving in rhythm with others can blur, the boundaries between self and others in the brain as well. Like again, when you start to treat the group as a unit, psychologists call this a merged sense of us and them, which many describe as feeling, at one with the group. And from an evolutionary standpoint as well, this makes sense, right? Like group cohesion would be enhanced by such neurochemical bonding. So I think collectively engaging in ritual dance or music kind of tunes multiple brain systems. You have motor coordination, emotional empathy, and reward circuits. So it's kind of a workout in a way for body and soul.
What about stress? Now, we've talked about mental flexibility, and obviously that's a positive thing for people being able to adapt. So that might be part of the answer to this. But I'm just curious, like when you see bicultural people or people who have spent time in other cultures and other places, what effect might that have on a person's stress systems in the brain? And also, is there any neurobiological data around this?
I mean, living in multiple cultures can be like a double-edged sword in a way, stress-wise. So on one hand, like bicultural individuals might face what is called a culturative stress, which is the challenge of meeting, sometimes conflicting cultural expectations. For example, an immigrant might feel stressed balancing their heritage,
Yeah,
culture's norms with the new society's norms. They might be worried about not fully fitting into either, which is common thing, you don't feel like you belong to either your source culture or the culture that you've just that you've just moved into. So this can kind of tax the brain's stress systems, which is like the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which kind of releases cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So if someone feels like they constantly have to code switch or hide part of their identity to belong, that can be a chronic stressor with potentially ill effects, elevated cortisol, anxiety, things like that. In fact, studies on immigrants kind of show that discrimination or identity conflict can manifest in higher stress hormones and worse mental health outcomes if
sure.
not addressed. So it's not all easy, and
Yeah.
and also this is important. So if a bicultural person kind of achieves, harmonious identity, which is what researchers call bicultural integration, they often show greater resilience. So it can be a force for good, but they can draw coping strengths from both cultures. They can have a wider social support network. Also, like we spoke about, a more flexible worldview from reappraising stressors. That flexibility can reduce overall stress impact, but I think the important piece here is the feeling of belonging. Just feeling like you belong to any cultural community seems to be like a huge buffer against stress.
Is the belonging sort of the key ingredient to the bicultural integration?
That's what it seems like, we're such social animals, feeling accepted and understood in a group, be it an ethnic group, a religious group, a national group, or even just a club that you join. It can provide emotional support and tangible help during tough times. Neuroscience shows that social support actually calms the brain's stress response. This famous experiment which found that individuals with a supportive friend present during a stressful task had significantly lower cortisol spikes than those without support. And even just the perception that I have people who have who've got my back, think it's
Yeah.
okay, can kind of dampen how one's body kind of responds to stress. Simply feeling that you belong to a cultural group, it often means built-in social support, family, community events, and a shared identity that can kind of give you confidence and can literally lower blood pressure, cortisol in stressful situations,
Yeah.
thanks to the soothing effect of these hormones that we spoke about, oxytocin and other social bonding hormones that are released when we feel supported. Yeah.
On this topic around collective versus individualistic cultures. And oftentimes, individualistic cultures are sort of synonymous with Western, what identified as Western cultures, and non-Western cultures are often collectivistic type of cultures. And I'm wondering what you might have to say about that and neural activity and neural development in terms of how the brain structures around these different types of cultural societal organizations.
There are, remarkable differences. Like culture can subtly influence even the way our brain distinguishes, self from others, which is kind of the main difference between, individualistic cultures, which people are raised to think of themselves as independent identities, whereas in collectivist cultures, which are, common in much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, people more often see themselves, in terms of their relationships and group roles. Neuroscientific research has also captured echoes of this in brain activity. So there was one classic study by Zhu and colleagues in China, which, asked people to judge adjectives about themselves, their mother, or a public person. So in collectivist, Chinese participants, kind of thinking about themselves or about their mother kind of activated very similar brain areas, particularly in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a
Hmm,
region associated with self-referential thinking. So
interesting.
in fact, yeah, for these participants, mother and self were almost psychologically merged at a neural level. The brain didn't strongly distinguish between me and mom in that medial prefrontal region. By contrast, individualistic Western participants in similar studies showed a clearer separation. Like the medial prefrontal cortex was active for self-judgments, but not really nearly as much for, their mother. Like basically, you're treating someone close to you more like a separate person. So this is kind of a stunning illustration because it suggests that in collectivist minds, close others, especially family, are integrated into the self concept to a degree that's actually measurable in brain responses, right? This kind of teaches us about empathy and identity as well, right? For one, it aligns with the idea that collectivist cultures cultivate a more interdependent self. Your identity overlaps with your family, your community, or in group. Empathy might be more readily extended to those in group members because they're seen as part of, the self. This doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's not that one culture is more empathetic than the other overall, but to whom the empathy is directed towards can actually differ. So collectivist folks might feel extremely empathetic and duty bound towards their in group, sometimes to the point of self sacrifice, but they might not feel as much obligation to strangers, whom they perceive as being outside the group. Brain studies kind of reflect this. We see cultural variation in neural responses to seeing loved ones versus strangers in pain, for instance. But yeah, fundamentally, I think all humans have the capacity for empathy. I think culture just guides where that spotlight of empathy is, shown as a habit. I also wanted to make the point that, we could broaden the ways in which we think about, in group versus out group. The brain data that we're looking at kind of essentially validates that culture, runs deep. It can reach into how our neurons fire when we consider who we are and who matters to us. And, recognizing this kind of reminds us that behaviors that might seem odd across cultures are rooted in these ingrained neural or cognitive frameworks. It kind of teaches us empathy by revealing that, our brains are kind of wired by our cultural values. And, people aren't just being difficult, they're being who their world kind of
Yeah.
taught them to be, and it also means that we can choose to rewire a bit. For instance, Westerners who feel that they're being more individualistic than necessary, could, deliberately try to practice a more interdependent mindset, like community volunteering to broaden that self circle. On the flip side, collectivists can kind of practice independence in safe ways to kind of empower personal agency as well, which is also really important. Like we spoke about, our brains are plastic, so cultural wiring can evolve. It's not hardwired, especially now that we are increasingly aware of these patterns.
Yeah, Aditi, that's really fascinating stuff. And I wasn't aware of some of those brain studies that were done in China that you had mentioned, for example, that shows the areas of the brain where the merging of the self with the mother or the family member is seen through the neural connections. And makes a lot of sense. And it's really, really fascinating that there's some hard wiring there around
Yeah.
this idea of collectivist versus individualistic approaches through culture. So that's really cool. Let's try something a little bit outside of the box here. And, we're in this digital age and digital culture where people are connecting more online and they're forming online communities. And obviously, a lot of people have a lot to say about people spending a lot of time glued to media and to the screen time and whatnot, connecting to communities more digitally and globally than even within their own neighborhood. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how this type of cultural change might be shaping and affecting neural development.
Yeah, we are in uncharted but I think exciting territory here. Like digital technology has kind of created a virtual melting pot really that no previous generation had access to. You can be a
Right.
teenager in a small town and yet you can regularly interact with peers across the globe, through online gaming or social media or virtual exchange programs. So intuitively, I think this virtual cultural exposure should confer some of the benefits of real exposure, though likely in a more diluted form, I'd say, since, obviously nothing quite replaces being, in person with all five senses engaged. But we're already seeing some effects. For instance, studies of virtual exchange programs in education find that students who engage with overseas peers via video calls and joint online projects do improve their intercultural communication skills, empathy, and global awareness. They learn to collaborate across cultural differences through a screen, gaining some of that perspective
Yeah.
shifting experience that physical travel provides. It's like a lighter version of living abroad. And from a brain standpoint as well, interacting via Zoom or VR kind of still exercises those, social cognition networks. You have to still interpret other people's facial expressions, you have to adjust to their accents, maybe learn bits of their language or etiquette. So these neural pathways for cultural learning can activate even if the medium is virtual. So there's fascinating research from Stanford where they used VR, virtual reality, to kind of let people walk in someone else's shoes.
Hmm.
And in one study, participants experienced a VR simulation of becoming homeless. So, and the result was that those who did the VR kind of developed more long-lasting compassion for homeless individuals compared to those who only read about, homelessness or watched a video. So, I think this suggests that immersive virtual experiences can indeed, tap into empathy circuits similarly to real experiences. And the VR people who had undergone VR, their brains were tricked in a way into feeling like they had gone through those hardships themselves, which kind of triggered emotional learning that seems to have stuck. So that's very promising. It kind of means VR could be used to reduce bias or increase understanding between cultures by simulating experiences. Researchers have even dubbed VR as, the ultimate empathy machine. And
Yeah.
while that is debated, initial evidence, I think, is kind of positive for perspective taking.
Well, VR is really actually a fascinating platform for this whole discussion because it does allow people to immerse themselves in a way that they haven't been able to before in another place, in another culture. It obviously is not the same thing as actually being
Yeah.
there, but it's probably about as close as we could get. And like most people are not going to be able to just sort of beam themselves to New Delhi and experience being in New Delhi.
Yeah.
But at least with VR, you can sort of like be there and walk around and get sort of like
Mhm.
some flavor. And especially if there are platforms to meet people there or in other places,
Right.
you have a little
Yeah.
bit more connection. You can see their faces. So it's really
Mhm.
fascinating. And I guess it'll be interesting to see where this all goes in the next 1 or 2 decades, right?
Yeah, it really will. And, I'd also add a small caution here. Like online algorithms have this tendency to kind of create echo chambers, right? Like pockets of culture where you only hear your own view, which
Yeah.
kind of can be the opposite of broadening. So the onus is on us and on platform designers to kind of ensure digital culture kind of remains a tool for expansion and not for, further siloing, really. So if used well, I think the digital world can really democratize cultural exchange. So, your neural development might include understanding, an international sense of humor, being attuned to multiple accents, things that our ancestors' brains did not have access to. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it does have benefits, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know what? That is such a good point because the other side of the digital world is it can make it very easy for you to connect with a lot of people who are exactly like you, even if they're in other
Yeah,
countries, right? It gives you an echo chamber spot to
exactly. Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
to reinforce exactly the way you think about things. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like all other technology, there's a bright side and a dark side to
Hmm.
it,
Hmm.
and I guess we're just constantly evolving as a species and adapting to these. Aditi, this has been really fascinating conversation about culture, and I love having your neuroscientist hat on talking about this. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts for us on the topic of how exposure to different cultures expands the mind.
Sure. So my closing thought, I think, would be a bit of encouragement and, also a bit of awe. Like embracing different cultures is one of the most enriching things that we can do really for our brains and for our hearts. It's clear from everything we discussed that, it fuels creativity, increases mental agility, reduces bias, and, it builds bridges between peoples. What your ideas are of normal or beautiful or true can all often be, challenged and expanded. Your world is wider and, and rather than leaving you unmoored, it actually grounds you in a larger sense of human connection. So you realize that, there are many ways to live and think, and that's okay. That's even exciting. And neuroscience kind of just puts a highlighter on what we intuitively feel when we travel or meet someone from a different background. We actually grow, right? Like new dendrites sprout as we learn a phrase in another language. Our empathy circuits kind of light up as we hear someone's life story from across the world. To borrow a line I wrote in the Psychology Today article that I think still rings true for me. When we bring cultures together with openness and respect, we don't dilute meaning, we actually expand it. So each time you add another culture's knowledge or perspective to your own, you're not losing anything, you're creating something bigger. It's not a zero sum game. You don't lose your culture by appreciating another. In fact, you gain like a broader identity and a sense that, you're a citizen of a larger world. And yeah, and in the process, as I've seen in my life and research, we stretch our capacity for creativity, empathy, and connection. And I think these are superpowers we really need in today's interconnected worlds. Yeah, I think my just final take home message would be, if you have the chance to immerse in another culture, whether by traveling, befriending someone different from you, or even just sampling art and literature from elsewhere, just do it. It's not just a nice thing to do, it'll literally expand who you are, and your neurons. And yeah, and
Yeah.
that expansion is what drives us forward. So
Yeah, better brain growth than milk, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. Aditi, very wise words and very interesting, fascinating topic. Thanks so much for coming and being on the show, and I really enjoyed interviewing you about this important topic.
Oh, thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you for having me. This was great. I really enjoyed talking to you about this. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Mind Tricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about Mind Tricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to Mind Tricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of Mind Tricks. Please take some time to give Mind Tricks a good rating and review wherever you are listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share Mind Tricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.